She had been the company's ghost for 11 years, the kind of presence you register only when something critical breaks and suddenly you need her expertise to hold the entire infrastructure together. And Marcus Hale never once bothered to learn her name properly, calling her the back-end person or that developer in meetings where he took credit for systems she had architected from scratch while he was still learning what an API endpoint was. Elena Kovacs had built the entire claims processing engine that powered HealthBridge Solutions, the medical insurance platform that had catapulted the company from a regional player into a billion-dollar acquisition target. And she had done it quietly, methodically, without seeking recognition because the work itself mattered more than her ego. But Marcus had a different philosophy entirely. He believed leadership meant visibility, charisma, the ability to sell a vision even when you had no idea how to execute it. And he had parlayed that belief into a vice president title, a corner office, and a reputation among the board as the visionary behind HealthBridge's technical transformation. While Elena worked 16-hour days in a windowless room fixing the cascading failures his poorly conceived directives created. The acquisition talks with Meridian Health Systems had been underway for 8 months, a complex merger that would create the third-largest health insurance technology provider in North America, and Marcus had positioned himself as indispensable to the transition, appearing in every investor presentation, every board briefing, every press release as the chief architect of the platform that made HealthBridge worth acquiring. Elena had watched this performance with detached fascination, the way you might observe a confidence artist working a crowd, admiring the craft even as you recognize the fraud. And she had said nothing because she understood corporate dynamics well enough to know that challenging a VP publicly would only damage her own position while accomplishing nothing substantive. The company had grown too fast, absorbing 3 smaller competitors in 18 months, and the technical debt had accumulated like sediment in a river, invisible until it choked the entire system. But Marcus kept promising seamless integration, bulletproof security, infinite scalability, using buzzwords he barely understood to reassure executives who understood them even less. Elena had sent him detailed reports outlining the architectural vulnerabilities, the security gaps, the performance bottlenecks that would collapse under the load Meridian's user base would bring, but he had dismissed every warning as pessimistic thinking and resistance to change, forwarding her emails to HR with suggestions that she might benefit from coaching on executive communication and alignment with company vision. Marcus had no idea she was doing this because he had no idea what she did at all, assuming her work was interchangeable with any other developers, a commodity skill set that could be replaced with offshore contractors or enthusiastic bootcamp graduates who would accept half her salary and twice her workload. He had said as much in a leadership meeting she was not supposed to have heard about, but Priya from infrastructure had a habit of leaving Zoom calls unmuted when she walked away for coffee, and Elena had listened to Marcus explain his post-merger staffing strategy, which included sunsetting legacy technical resources and bringing in fresh perspectives that would accelerate our transformation journey. The claims adjudication system had failed its validation checks for the previous night's run, meaning thousands of medical claims were stuck in processing limbo, unable to move forward or roll back, frozen in a state that violated every data integrity principle the platform was built on. He had been demonstrating initiative, responding to a Meridian executive's casual complaint about processing speeds by ordering the offshore team to bypass the validation layer entirely and push claims through faster. And they had done exactly what he asked, removing the safeguards that prevented corrupt data from propagating through the entire system. Elena spent the next 6 hours rebuilding the validation logic, manually reviewing every failed claim, restoring data integrity while the business units screamed about delayed payments and angry providers threatening to drop HealthBridge from their networks. And she knew Marcus would blame her for the outage even though she had prevented it from becoming an unrecoverable disaster. The all-hands meeting was scheduled for 3 that afternoon in the main conference room, the one with the glass walls that turned every gathering into a performance for whoever happened to be walking past. And Marcus stood at the front looking appropriately concerned, his sleeves rolled up in that calculated way executives do when they want to signal they are personally handling a crisis. He began with platitudes about learning opportunities and growing pains before pivoting to what he called accountability. And Elena felt the room's energy shift as everyone realized this was not a post-mortem but a public execution. Marcus pulled up a slide showing the previous night's failure metrics, the red bars dramatically oversized to emphasize severity, and he said the outage had occurred because certain members of the technical team failed to properly maintain critical systems, refusing to name Elena directly but ensuring everyone knew exactly who he meant by describing her role, her tenure, her specific responsibilities in language that made the connection unmistakable. He continued by explaining that the company could no longer afford to carry replaceable resources who resist innovation and slow down progress. And the word replaceable hung in the air like smoke, designed to humiliate, to reduce her 11 years of institutional knowledge and architectural expertise into something disposable, something you could order from a catalog and have delivered overnight. She felt the eyes on her, colleagues glancing away when she tried to meet their gaze, and she understood this was not about the outage at all but about the merger, about Marcus eliminating anyone who might contradict his narrative or threaten his position in the new organization. Alina did not defend herself in the meeting because she knew it would be pointless, that Marcus had already decided her fate and was simply performing the justification for HR's benefit, but she also knew something he did not. The claims processing engine was not simply code that could be replaced or reassigned, but an intricate system of proprietary algorithms, custom integration layers, and undocumented architectural decisions that existed nowhere except in her mind and her private repositories, and while the company technically owned the code she had written. Marcus had never bothered to learn these details because he measured his value in strategic vision rather than technical depth, and he assumed that any competent developer could step into Alina's role and maintain the system using the documentation she had created. But Alina's documentation was deliberately incomplete, describing what the system did without explaining why it did it that way, and the why was everything. She had built in layers of defensive programming, fail-safes that prevented catastrophic failures even when upstream systems fed garbage data, and these protections were invisible when everything worked correctly but absolutely critical when things went wrong. And Marcus was about to learn this lesson in the most expensive way possible. The termination meeting occurred 2 days later in an HR conference room that smelled like recycled air and institutional anxiety, and Marcus was not even present, sending his director of operations instead to deliver the news with the kind of scripted compassion HR professionals learn in workshops about managing difficult conversations. She was not sabotaging anything or creating deliberate vulnerabilities but simply removing her safety net, the invisible scaffolding of institutional knowledge that had prevented Marcus's incompetence from causing permanent damage, and she was curious to see what would happen when that protection disappeared. The merger closed 6 weeks after her termination, Meridian Health Systems completing their acquisition of HealthBridge in a transaction valued at $1.4 billion. And Marcus received a promotion to Senior Vice President of Technology Integration with a compensation package that included restricted stock units worth several $1 million based on successful platform consolidation over the following year. Alina watched the press releases from her apartment, drinking tea and building her consulting practice one careful client conversation at a time, and she waited for the inevitable disaster with the patience of someone who understands complex systems and knows exactly when they will fail. The integration plan Marcus had presented to Meridian's board called for migrating all HealthBridge claims processing to Meridian's existing infrastructure within 4 months, decommissioning the legacy systems Alina had built and consolidating everything onto what Marcus described as a modern, scalable, cloud-native architecture that would reduce operational costs by 40% while improving processing speeds. The plan looked impressive in PowerPoint, full of migration timelines and risk mitigation strategies and technical diagrams that suggested careful analysis. But Alina knew it was fundamentally impossible because Meridian's platform could not handle the complex medical coding requirements and state-specific regulatory variations that HealthBridge's system navigated automatically. The first signs of trouble appeared during the initial data migration when Meridian's platform began rejecting claims that contained valid but unusual medical codes, edge cases that occurred rarely enough that initial testing had not caught them, but frequently enough that they affected thousands of patients whose treatments were suddenly denied coverage incorrectly. Marcus's team assumed these were data quality issues on HealthBridge's side and assigned them to the offshore development team to investigate and resolve. But the offshore team had no context for why these codes existed or how the legacy system handled them, and their attempted fixes made everything worse, introducing new validation errors that cascaded through the entire claims database. Alina heard about these problems through her network of former colleagues who had survived the merger and were now working 18-hour days trying to understand systems they had never seen before while Marcus attended executive meetings, assuring everyone that integration was proceeding on schedule. The crisis escalated when three major hospital networks notified Meridian they were terminating their contracts due to an unacceptable rate of claim denials and payment delays. And suddenly the merger that was supposed to create industry-leading efficiencies was threatening to destroy the company's provider relationships and trigger regulatory investigations in 7 states. Meridian's CEO brought in an external consulting firm to assess the technical situation, a team of enterprise architects and systems analysts who spent 2 weeks reviewing code repositories, interviewing developers, analyzing incident reports, and they delivered a conclusion that sent shockwaves through the executive suite. The HealthBridge claims processing system could not be migrated to Meridian's platform without a complete architectural redesign that would take at least 18 months and cost upward of $60 million. The consultants were particularly scathing about the decision to terminate the original system architect without ensuring proper knowledge transfer or maintaining her as a technical advisor during the transition, describing it as catastrophically negligent, and noting that the missing documentation and architectural context had already cost the company months of productivity and millions in remediation costs. Marcus attempted to deflect blame by suggesting Alina had deliberately sabotaged the documentation before leaving, but the consultants pointed out that her termination had been his decision, that he had never requested knowledge transfer sessions or transition planning, and that the company's own HR records showed she had offered to provide consulting support during the separation negotiation but had been refused. The board meeting that followed was brutal and brief, and while Alina was not present, she heard the details from Priya, who had been asked to present technical findings to the directors. Marcus had attempted to maintain his narrative about vision and transformation, arguing that the integration challenges were temporary setbacks that would ultimately prove worthwhile. But the board had already seen the consulting firm's report and understood they were facing a potential existential threat to the combined company. Meridian's chairman asked Marcus directly whether he had read the architectural risk assessments Alina had sent him before the merger, whether he had understood the warnings about system compatibility and regulatory complexity, and Marcus had been forced to admit he had not reviewed them in detail because he had trusted his team to handle implementation details while he focused on strategic direction. The chairman asked why Marcus had terminated the person who understood these risks better than anyone else in the organization, and Marcus had no good answer, falling back on vague statements about culture fit and resistance to change that sounded increasingly hollow as the directors pressed for specifics. The vote to remove him from his position was unanimous, effective immediately, and his separation agreement included a clause requiring him to forfeit his unvested stock options and return a portion of his merger bonus based on the measurable damages his decisions had caused. Alina received the call 3 days later from Meridian's interim CTO, a careful conversation that began with an apology for how the company had treated her, and evolved into a negotiation about what it would take to bring her back as an independent technical advisor at a rate that would make her one of the highest-paid consultants in the company's history. She named her terms carefully, not with vindictiveness but with the clarity of someone who understood exactly what her knowledge was worth and how desperately they needed it. And she required complete architectural authority over the claims processing platform, direct reporting access to the CEO, and a contractual guarantee that no technical decisions would be made without her written approval for a period of 2 years. They agreed to everything because they had no choice, because Alina was the only person who understood the systems well enough to prevent the regulatory catastrophe that was currently unfolding in slow motion, and because fixing Marcus's disaster would require not just technical expertise, but the kind of institutional knowledge that cannot be recreated from documentation or reverse-engineered from code repositories. She returned to the office not as an employee, but as the single most essential person in the building, the invisible ghost who had built everything now revealed as the only one who could prevent it all from collapsing. And she spent the next 18 months methodically rebuilding what Marcus had broken, training teams who now understood why her seemingly over-engineered solutions were necessary, documenting architectural decisions in ways that actually explained the reasoning behind them. Marcus found work eventually at a smaller healthcare technology company that had not followed the HealthBridge disaster closely, and he lasted 14 months before they discovered he had exaggerated his technical contributions on his resume, and that the award-winning platform he claimed to have architected had actually been built by someone he had fired. Alina heard about his subsequent termination through industry contacts and felt nothing in particular, no satisfaction or vindication, just the mild curiosity you might feel reading about a historical event that no longer affected you personally. She had moved beyond revenge because revenge implied she had been diminished by what he had done, and the truth was Marcus had never possessed the power to diminish her, only to temporarily obscure her value until circumstances made it impossible to ignore. The consulting contract evolved into a permanent advisory role, then into a board position at Meridian where her technical judgment became as influential as any executive's strategic vision. And she found herself in meetings where decisions that would have been made by people like Marcus were now run through her analysis first. Her quiet questions about implementation complexity and regulatory risk, preventing the kind of catastrophic overconfidence that destroyed companies and careers. She never mentioned Marcus or referenced what had happened, because leaders who actually understand their domain do not need to perform their expertise or diminish others to establish credibility, and everyone who mattered already knew exactly who had built the systems that made the entire company possible. The company thrived after the integration was finally completed, not through dramatic transformation or revolutionary innovation, but through the careful, methodical work of people who understood that real technical excellence is invisible when everything works correctly and catastrophically obvious when it does not. Elena continued consulting because she preferred the autonomy it offered, the ability to solve complex problems without the performance requirements of executive leadership, and she occasionally thought about Marcus and wondered if he understood yet what he had lost, not her presence specifically but the principle she represented. The answer was probably that he did not understand and never would, that his entire worldview was built on the assumption that leadership meant visibility and influence rather than competence and depth, and that belief would continue to fail him until he either learned differently or ran out of companies willing to take the risk of hiring someone whose resume promised vision, but whose execution delivered disaster. She had moved beyond caring about his trajectory because her own path had proven something more important than any individual revenge, which is that in systems complex enough to matter, the people who build the foundations ultimately matter more than the people who take credit for them, and eventually reality has a way of making that hierarchy visible to everyone who matters.